Consider the last 4 weeks, starting with heartbreaking revelations that American veterans were neglected and mistreated at VA hospitals across this country, forcing the president's VA Secretary, Eric Shinseki, to resign. Within days, a new national outcry after 5 top Taliban leaders are traded to terrorists in exchange for a captive American soldier, a soldier who's suspected of desertion. President Obama then stages a controversial celebration of sorts in the White House Rose Garden with the soldier's parents quoting from the Quran and appearing to empathize with the Taliban cause. Next, a chilling update from the southern border. More than 140,000 unaccompanied children expect to flood the country by next year, a crisis the administration may have set in motion itself and now seems challenged to stop or even slow. And then infuriating new developments in the IRS investigation. The tax agency that asks Americans to retain tax information for years, reportedly claiming to lose, thousands of critical emails from the woman at the center of the IRS scandal and several other employees. Now today, news that the total output of U.S. economy actually shrank in the first months of this year. The weakest numbers. And these numbers, this sort of shrinking number, not seen since the depths of the recession. While we also see early signs of new fallout from the crisis in Iraq, where the terrorists have seized 1/3 of the country, including some oil resources, raising fears of crippled oil supplies, invoking memories of shortages and the long gas lines of the 1970s. These events giving new voice to old warnings from the president's critics. Charles Krauthammer was among them, saying that the crises we see today are part and parcel of President Obama's long-term plan to downsize America.
There's a big difference between decline as a condition and decline as a choice. What we have with Obama is a president choosing decline.
Mark Thiessen is the former chief speechwriter to President George W. Bush and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And Joe Trippi is a veteran Democratic presidential campaign manager and a Fox News contributor. Thank you guys both for being here. Mark, let me start with you. Of those items we just ticked off, and we could go on, but those were the highlights or the lowlights, depending on how you want to characterize it. Which one jumps out at you the most as the most disturbing?
Well, they're all disturbing, which is part of the problem. I mean, take that 2.9% GDP decline figure you had. That is the worst decline in not during a recession of GDP in one single quarter since they started keeping statistics in 1949. So, this is seriously bad economic news, and it comes on top of the VA. It comes on top of the border crisis. It comes on top of the implosion of Iraq. It comes on top of the epidemic of hard drive malfunctions at the IRS. And that's just the last month. Before that, you had the Syria debacle, where we didn't enforce our red line. Where you had the Obamacare rollout. There's crisis upon crisis upon crisis. And look, when your foreign policy is imploding, when your economic policy is imploding, when your immigration policy is imploding, when your veterans policy is imploding, your presidency is imploding.
Joe, is this presidency imploding? We took a look at this about a week or a week and a half ago and asked whether the presidency was imploding. With all of these scandals and the polls coming back in terms of people's respect for the president, their trust in government, their belief that he can lead, all at record low numbers.
Well, the presidency may not be imploding, but his favorability and approval numbers sure are, and that creates all kinds of problems in terms of getting things done. Not just that, but has huge implications for the November 14th election. I know these are all serious problems, but in the end, from a practical matter, he wants to hold on to the U.S. Senate, and that, as these problems pile up and his numbers go down, that makes November holding on to the Senate a tougher and tougher problem for him, which then does cause the last 2 years of his presidency being a problem if the Republicans have both houses. So yeah, all these things matter, but the practical implication is right now that it's empowering a positive Republican outcome in November, and one that's not going to look good for the Democrats. And then, of course, that goes back to the presidency for the last 2 years. It's not imploded yet, but his numbers going down that causes a big problem.
You know, Mark, we referenced the Carter administration and those long gas lines and the general sense of malaise that President Carter himself referred to when he was talking to Americans. And there are many Americans out there who now feel, as a result of all we're seeing, that America itself is in decline.
Yeah, I don't think America is in decline. I think Charles is right when he says there's nothing wrong with America, but there's something wrong with our president. I mean, all of these that we've talked about are self-inflicted wounds. Every president faces crisis. I mean, I worked for George W. Bush. I understand what crises are like. Yeah. And, you know, he faced the worst terrorist attack in American history, the worst storm in American history, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. But the difference is these are all self-inflicted. Iraq is a self-inflicted wound. The VA scandal, self-inflicted. IRS, self-inflicted. The border, self-inflicted. These are things that he's doing. So these are conscious choices that the president is making. Another president can make different conscious choices. Some of these things can be fixed. Iraq, I don't know if Iraq can be fixed by a change in policy. But at least Jimmy Carter changed course. After Afghanistan, he increased the military defense budget. He changed at the very end. The Reagan defense increase actually started under Jimmy Carter, where there's no sign that Barack Obama sees the disaster his policies are wreaking and is changing course in any way.
Joe, do you believe that all we're seeing here is a result of President Obama's policies, or is it the result of something else? And you know, when it's one scandal or two scandals, even three scandals, you can sort of say, well, maybe these are like ginned up, right, by the president's opponents. But there are so many, and certainly the GDP shrinking is not something ginned up by anybody's opponents.
No, but it's very similar to the end of the Bush presidency. I'm not trying to, you know, come back at Mark, but I mean, look, Iraq, the economy, all of it was unraveling in the last few years of the Bush presidency. His favorable and approval ratings were in the tank, I think, just about exactly where Obama's are right now. It's not out of the ordinary. You know, this isn't a unique situation. I would have been saying the same, making the same case against Bush that Mark's making against Obama right now.
But let me interrupt you and ask you this, Joe. Let me ask you this, because, okay, fine on the overall poll numbers, but what we've seen recently with, you know, Sebelius basically forced out, Shinseki basically forced out, all this controversy about what's happened in Iraq, and that country now completely spiraling out of control, and the president's team saying they were caught off guard. They were caught off guard, and indeed in January the president called this group JV. Here we are in June, and Iraq is all but lost. That's not to mention what's happening with the IRS targeting conservative groups, the lack of faith the American public have in Eric Holder, who completely misled the public by saying he's never heard of the criminal prosecution of a journalist. Meantime, he was alleging that James Rosen was a criminal co-conspirator in a complaint that we then got our hands on. I mean, the list goes on and on. Why is it that every main figure in the administration seems to be in the headlines in connection with another scandal?
Well, I mean, one of the things is I think this administration has gone beyond looking at the polls or even, frankly, caring about them at this point. You are talking about the end of a presidency where they're looking at Iraq and all these questions, not at where they are in the poll numbers, but how do they deal with the situation with it?
Well, I get that, but that's not my question. My question is, is it just reaching critical mass? Is this something about President Obama? Why are there 10 to 12 scandals now engulfing this administration? Are they all made up by the opponents?
No, well, look, I don't know that they're all made up by the opponents, but certainly having the opposition being as strong and coming after the administration as strong as they have does matter. Look, Bush had 5 million emails disappear on them in the middle of illegal questions there. And this isn't tit for tat. They did it too. What I'm trying to say is a lot of these scandals that were talked about have gone on before. They are hitting this administration in consistent, like bam, 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 one another, which
it's like
the bigger problem is
it's like a prize fight, and the president is going down. Mark, my last question for you. The polls show that the American public believe this president is disengaged. He's just no longer into being president. Unfortunately, he has to continue doing it. I mean, it's like, unfortunately for him, if he is disengaged, I mean, you know, you can't really be disengaged as the president. You're not really allowed.
No, you're not allowed, and especially when the world is on fire as it is right now. And look, I'm not going to get into a tit for tat with Joe, but there's a big difference between, outside the fact that there weren't 12 scandals in the end of the Bush administration, is that in Iraq, Bush looked at Iraq, saw it was a disaster, and changed course. He changed the strategy and did the surge. Where is the sign that Barack Obama is changing course on any of these things? He's just staying the course as it goes, and the scandals are getting worse.
All right, guys, good to see you.
Thanks, Megan.